Um, Thanks very much to everybody, especially our speakers, for giving up their time tonight. I'm Kim Pratt. I'm the Circular Economy campaigner with Friends of the Earth Scotland. Um, so tonight is our Friends of the Earth Scotland webinar about fashioning the future. We are actually going to start the webinar tonight with a very quick update on the global strike for Palestine, which Kate is going to talk about in 2 minutes. And then I'll introduce our main event. We've got 4 fantastic speakers for you tonight who are going to talk to us about the different parts of the clothing supply chain and how we can improve that, make it more sustainable and more fair, and why we have to do that as well. And then we have some time for a very quick discussion, hopefully, on what we've heard. And then the last part of the evening is an optional discussion on the Circular Economy Bill, which is being introduced in Scotland. So I'm going to hand back to Kate very briefly to talk about the global strike for Palestine.
Thanks, Kim. Yeah, also just a bunch of people just joined whilst Kim was introducing then, so welcome. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Glad you made it. But yeah, I just wanted to start this evening by acknowledging and drawing attention to the fact that today the Palestinian people have called for a global strike in solidarity with what's happening in Palestine, and they've asked that labour and time is diverted towards education about the history and the ongoing situation in Palestine, as well as taking action to end the genocide, to call for a ceasefire and for a free Palestine. And when this global strike was announced a couple of days ago, we had considerations around whether to go ahead with this event, whether that was the right thing to do when a global strike has been called, and came to the decision that as we have a lot of people joining this call, maybe the most useful way to be in solidarity in that with this space is to use this platform and the spaces that we have to do those things that have been called for on this day. So we will go on to all the great speakers on the clothing industry that you came for, but we felt that it was appropriate to take a few minutes at the start of this event to acknowledge this global strike, the ongoing genocide, and highlight some of the actions that we can all take and some of the resources that we can look at to learn more about what's happening. As I've said in other FOS events in the last couple of weeks, some of you might have heard this, we're very aware that a large amount of capacity and energy from the kind of climate movement is being directed towards a ceasefire and for a free Palestine, and that is completely welcome and absolutely necessary if we're serious about calls for climate justice. At Friends of the Earth Scotland, we work towards a vision of a world where systems of power and resources are transformed so that all living beings and ecosystems have what they need to flourish now and in the future. And to me, that vision statement rings very, very real with what is currently happening in Palestine. And we see the same system of neocolonialism and dehumanization that has sanctioned the murder of over 20,000 Palestinian people in the last 2 months, and a million more people who are being starved and poisoned and displaced. And for us, that's while UK arms companies are profiting from arms sales, and UK fossil fuel companies like BP are snapping up gas licenses off the coast of Gaza, which is something that, Israeli energy ministers have said that shows confidence in that government. So it's very much our fight. And it's that same system, thinking about why we're all here tonight, that allows garment workers in the global south to be paid pennies and work in toxic environments, and that justifies us dumping huge amounts of our waste on other people and other people's lands. It's that same system of dehumanization and othering. And so, just wanted to say very strongly that there can be no climate justice without freedom and dignity for all people. So in terms of the things that we wanted to share, I wanted to share this podcast with our colleague Abir Butmer, who's from Friends of the Earth Palestine, or Faux Pengon, as they're called, which is called Living on the Front Lines of a War and the Climate Crisis. And it's about their ongoing struggle for land rights and water rights. And yeah, the harshest end of the climate crisis in the hardest conditions. So yeah, I would really recommend everyone listening to that podcast with, and obviously we send full solidarity to Friends of the Earth Palestine, our comrades. If people haven't, something you can do today is our MPs are going to be voting tomorrow on whether to end arms export licenses to Israel. And so there's a email template there. If you haven't already done that, that's something you could do today to ask your MP to vote for that. And if you could do one thing tomorrow, our friends at Tipping Point, a climate justice organisation in the UK, are organising a weekly power hour for Palestine on a Tuesday at 5 p.m. The link there for it. And it's basically like an hour on a Tuesday at 5 p.m. where they share history and information about the ongoing occupation and the current situation, and get people to participate in targeted actions to call for a ceasefire and for freedom and dignity for the Palestinian people. So we'll share those links again in the chat at the end, and I think we'll email them as well. But I'm going to pass back to Kim to get on with the rest of the evening. But yeah, we just wanted to make sure that we use this space to amplify some of those really important calls to action. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kate. And as you said, this is a really important call to action and linked to what we're going to be talking about today. So the main webinar tonight is about the way that we use materials, in particular clothing. So in the global north, the way that we use materials is incredibly unfair and unsustainable. And this needs to change if we are to have a chance of a livable future. Scotland has a big opportunity to take a step forwards towards creating that more sustainable future in the Circular Economy Bill, which is currently being reviewed by the Scottish Parliament. This new law is about making the way that we use materials more sustainable. Friends of the Earth Scotland are campaigning to make this new law as strong as possible. And that means embedding a commitment to fairer supply chains. It means improving the quality of the products that we buy so that they last for longer. And it also means better ways to dispose of products when they reach the end of their life. Clothing is an incredibly important example of the way that we use materials today. And we're going to hear about the issues with our current system, but also as well about the solutions that we need to adopt if we're going to make our clothing more sustainable and fairer. So it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce you to our speakers. We have 4 speakers. Firstly, Jemima Elliot, who is a freelance journalist who's worked with an organisation called Remade, which is a global advocacy organisation fighting for fair pay and climate justice with the clothing industry. We also have Ursak Trunk, a campaign manager for the Changing Markets Foundation, who is going to tell us about the impacts of clothing waste. We have Izzie Eriksen, the founder and CEO of ApparelXChange, a children's wear reuse organisation that's based in Glasgow. And she's going to tell us about some of the exciting changes that are already happening in Scotland around clothing reuse. And then we have Ruth Ogier, head of international programmes for War on Want, who's going to tell us about what a more sustainable and fairer clothing system could look like in the future. So each of our speakers is going to speak for about 10 minutes. Please feel free to put some questions in the chat. Hopefully we'll have time for some discussion at the end. We'll keep all the questions till the end, but please do put questions in the chat if you have them. And at about 8 p.m, we're going to wrap up the discussion of clothing and then invite people to stay on for a further 20 minutes, which is going to be an optional discussion on the Circular Economy Bill. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jemima Elliot, who is going to tell us about the environmental and social impacts of our current clothing supply chain. Jemima.
Oh. Thank you, Kim. And yeah, thank you to both Kim and Kate for having me today. It's so lovely to come and speak to you all. So yes, I'm Jemima. I'm based in Newcastle. And I am, as Kim said, a climate justice journalist and campaigner. But I specialise in the fashion industry and workers' rights. And yes, I've been working for a few years. Particularly with Remake, on a wide variety of campaigns that I'll probably tell you about. There's so much to cover. I won't be able to cover everything in 10 minutes, but hopefully we'll be able to share some resources that you can do some more research with later on. So yes, as the others have alluded to, the fashion industry is based on a system of violence, and it's a system of a variety of violences. Whether that's wage violence, gendered and sexual violence, colonial violence. There's so many different forms, but it's the bedrock of the fashion system. There are so many different ways that it's affected. I think it's useful to go back to the beginning and to see where the fashion supply chain actually begins. So often it begins with farmers who are growing crops like cotton that will be made and into fibers and materials, which will then get stitched and made into the clothing we wear today. But often as well, it actually starts with oil rig workers in projects like Rosebank, which we're all aware of, as the majority of our clothes now are made from polyester, which is oil. So yeah, oil-based polyester accounts for around 50% of fiber production, which is massive. So, you know, when we're talking about projects like Cambo and Rosebank and Jackdaw, all of these things are also affecting our clothing as well. Like clothes that I'm wearing today, undoubtedly also made of polyester. So all come from the same place. So that aside, throughout the supply chain, there are different levels of exploitation and violence. Farmers are not paid enough. The oil rig workers at the beginning aren't paid enough, and the people in, you know, in refineries have been various strikes and stuff as well in the UK. I grew up in Pembrokeshire. I remember, I think it was a couple of years ago, there were strikes at the refineries near where I grew up. So even throughout the supply chain, before we even get to the stage where garment workers are sewing together the pieces of materials, there is violence on a number of levels. But I think fashion is a really interesting industry in terms of looking at how kind of a variety of violent systems intersect. So, for example, it's a really useful way to see how gender, colonialism, and capitalism all converge together to cause harm. So around 80% of garment workers are young women aged 18 to 24 who live in previously colonized countries. So these are women who are my age, I'm 24, who are in really harsh conditions. They're not being paid enough. Only about 2% of garment workers worldwide are paid a living wage. So if we see the vast majority of garment workers are young women, and even more, even a higher percentage of that are not being paid a living wage, we can see how it's a massively gendered and race way of looking at things as well. So while the vast majority of garment workers are women, the vast majority of fashion CEOs are white men who are based in Europe or America. So you only have to look at the vast majority of these companies to see how the split in workers and the split in profits are shared. And as Kim said earlier, it's not a fair system at all. I'd also like to say, in the spirit of the global strike for Palestine, I'd also like to share this resource, which I'll put a link to in the chat, which is a group of anti-sweatshop Activists have put together a campaign standing in solidarity with Palestine and standing against apartheid. So you can have a look through this. It's got this website here has got loads of information about how brands profit from apartheid and Palestinian oppression. So I'd really highly recommend looking at that and looking at how all of these issues are connected. So yeah, the fashion industry relies on low wages and a lack of safe working conditions in order to make a profit. We saw that with Rana Plaza, the factory collapse in 2013, so 10 years ago now. We had the 10-year anniversary in April, where over 1,000 workers lost their lives after the factory collapsed. The factory, they'd already seen that there were massive holes in the walls and cracks, and it was unsafe, and workers were told that they would lose their already poverty wages if they refused to work that day. So many of them went in highly suspecting that something would happen, and many of them lost their lives. Many more were injured so badly they lost their ability to work. And since then, there has been a lot of improvement, a lot of changes, particularly with the International Accord on Fire and Safety, Fire and Building Safety, which many brands have signed, which enforces a safe working environments, which is the bare minimum, really. Like, you wouldn't want to go into work if you knew that there was a potential that there would be massive fires or the building could collapse on you. It's the bare minimum to be able to have a safe workplace. But there's still a long way to go, even though the Accord has made huge impacts and saved so many lives in the decade since its implementation. So currently, I think one really important thing that's happening at the moment is there are huge wage protests in Bangladesh by Bangladeshi garment workers. This is the same country where Rana Plaza happened, and it has been at the center of kind of garment worker rights campaigns ever since. So yeah, in Bangladesh, there have been massive protests around an increased monthly living wage from about 8,000 taka, which is roughly £58 a month. And garment worker unions are asking for the government to increase the minimum wage to 23,000 taka a month, which is about £167. The government have raised the minimum wage after protest to about 12,500 taka, which is £90 a month. But this is not going far enough. The protests are not stopping, because that's nowhere near what garment workers need to survive. They've been living on poverty wages for years, and like this, fully saying enough is enough. Garment workers are really pushing, and they've been pushing for years. So in Bangladesh, there are about 4 million garment workers. It's a huge, huge country for the textile industry, and the textile industry is really crucial to the Bangladeshi economy. So since then, since the protests began, around 3 workers have died in the protests. It's got quite violent, and only Patagonia, of all the brands in the world, only Patagonia has publicly called for the wage increase to 23,000 taka. This follows the fact that a few months ago, early this year, a trade union leader was murdered there as well. So it's a huge, huge risk. As we see, we've had the summer of strikes. We've had so many strikes these past couple of years. And it's some of the same reasons that have been causing inflation, but in Bangladesh and in other garment producing countries too. So yeah, there's a huge amount that's happening. But while inflation has increased, like, garment workers were already on poverty wages and were struggling to survive. But there's huge amounts happening at the moment, and if we can do our best to support them, that would be, that's great. That's what we need to apply pressure to brands to call for this. Yeah, so I'm conscious of time because there's so much I could say. But yeah, there's so much to talk about, whether That's wage violence, but also sexual violence. I remember a few years ago, there's one particular woman who stays with me, called Izzie Eriksen, who on New Year's Day 2021 was murdered by her supervisor after being sexually assaulted by him. I was the same age as Izzie at the time. I think she was 2021. I was the same age as her, and she's really stuck with me since. And her case really shows an endemic violence within the fashion system. In Bangladesh, again, coming back to Bangladesh, there are many other statistics from other countries, but I just have some from Bangladesh. Around 80% of garment workers have reported seeing like sexual violence happening. And in 2017, CARE organisation CARE found that 1 in 3 garment workers reported an incident of sexual harassment. So these systems, whether they're colonialism, patriarchy, capitalism, the way they all intersect comes at the oppression of garment workers, who are just trying to survive, who are incredibly skilled and who are put down by these systems, and they're put into massive danger because of them. Izzie Eriksen and the workers who are being killed in the wage protests at the moment, the people who were killed in Rana Plaza, were all killed by systemic violence and injustice. But there's massive changes to be made, as I'm sure the other panelists will talk about. And yes, I think that's probably about time, even though I could go on for a lot longer. But yes, the Circular Economy Bill is a really exciting start, and is part of a ever-growing group of global legislation to tackle these issues. So yeah, I'll hand back to Kim. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jemima. That was a really interesting start to the discussions. And if you have any links on the call to action that you mentioned to put pressure onto brands, if there's anything you can put into the chat, that would be great for people to be able to do more on that. We're going to move swiftly on to Ursak. Ursak, do you want to share your presentation?
Yes, let me try. I hope this works.
I should say that Ursak is from the Changing Markets Foundation, and they have a campaign around fossil fashion, and she's going to be talking about what happens to our clothing when it gets to the end of its life.
So I'm sorry, it seems like I'm not able to share my screen.
Okay.
Is it possible that you share my presentation?
Yeah. Technology is definitely not.
Yes. Not a good day for technology.
No.
Yes, that's perfect. Oh, great. Thank you so much.
Okay. Just let me know when you need me to flip through.
Great. So thank you for introduction, Kim. So I'm Ursak. I'm a campaign manager at the Changing Markets Foundation. We are essentially an environmental NGO, and we're known for our campaigns on exposing irresponsible practices by companies in different sectors. But fashion has really been one of our core focuses. You can already switch to the next slide. We have been campaigning on fashion for almost 7 years now. And we do a lot of investigative work. We, for example, dig into where and how our clothes are made. We have been annually assessing fashion brands in our synthetic anonymous reports on their practices and policies to move away from the fast fashion model. And we have also done on-the-ground investigations into what happens with fast fashion once we're done with it. So I'm not going to dive into all of this, but I'll try to focus a bit on the waste aspect. And just to say, all of this investigation and work has been done in the context of our fossil fashion campaign. And as the name reveals, it highlights fashion industry's increasing reliance on fossil fuels. And I'm not talking about the transport or the energy needed to produce clothing, but what our clothes are actually made of. And I'm sure many of you are aware, and as Jemima already pointed out, majority of what we wear today is made from fossil fuels. You can go to the next slide. Synthetic fibers such as polyester, nylon, acrylic, elastan today account for 69% of all textile production. Synthetics are cheap. They cost about half per kilo as cotton. They're versatile, and they allow fashion brands to produce a lot of usually low quality items. And then on the other side, for us consumers to treat clothing as increasingly disposable and throw them away faster once the fashion trends change or once the clothing wears out. And then there is this clear connection between synthetics and fast fashion. And this is what this graph actually represents. Don't get scared, it's actually quite simple. So it shows the production of different fibers throughout the history. And at the very bottom in green, you have cotton. And you can see that historically, cotton has kind of taken the biggest chunk of fiber production up till the year 2000, where you can see that the one in pink, polyester, became more popular than cotton. And from that point on, you can see that the production of polyester skyrockets. At the same time, the production of cotton kind of stays the same. And the production of clothing doubles. But as you can see, majority of this is pink, majority is produced from polyester. So while we are now at 69% of all fibers being produced from synthetics, if we continue down this road, in just 7 years, almost 3/4 of everything we wear will be produced from oil and gas. Next slide, please. And of course, this also reflects on consumer behavior because we're buying more than ever, but we're also throwing it away faster. So an average consumer today buys 60% more clothes than in 2000, but wears them half as long. And the sale of clothing is actually, as you can see from the graph, growing faster than the world GDP. And some items are increasingly being, worn and thrown away just after 7 or 8 uses. Next slide, please. And so this, of course, contributes to a huge waste crisis, not to mention microplastic pollution. We have 2 years ago analyzed 4,000 clothing items by 12 fashion brands and kind of the statements that the brands make linked to these items. And we found that 59% of the claims they made were greenwashing. They were unsubstantiated and basically misleading to consumers. So these are some of the items we analyzed that are in fashion brands' sustainable or conscious collections, and they were selling them as, being better for the planet, made to be recycled, and so forth. But then you take a closer look and you can see, for example, that these items are made from 5 or sometimes even 6 fiber types. And once you have this, cocktail of fibers, an item like this can never be recycled and is basically destined to be landfilled or incinerated. Also, once you have elastan present in an item, it acts as a contaminant and it cannot be recycled. So placing items like that in a sustainable or conscious collection is really straight greenwashing. And next slide, please. And one of the biggest kind of examples of greenwashing today is recycled polyester. I'm sure you've seen it entering any stores on the high street, like looking at the major fast fashion brands. And you might think this is great, they're producing new clothes from old clothes, but actually 93% of all recycled fibers today come from plastic bottles. And this is a false solution because we already have closed loop system to recycle bottles continuously back to bottles. But once you take a bottle and you make a shirt or a dress out of it, this can never be recycled again. So it's destined to be landfilled or incinerated. Yet we see that the majority of brands are adopting this as the main sustainability strategy, producing clothes from plastic bottles. And what we see is that, you know, the fashion industry is not actually dealing with their own waste, because less than 1% of old clothes are recycled to new clothes. And as a comparison of how many brands are planning to actually increase their use of recycled polyester, compared to how many are actually investing in fiber-to-fiber technologies, you can see that it's like half, you know, 43% compared to 83%. So it's a big greenwashing technique currently being adopted by the fashion industry. Now looking at just the impacts of what happens then with the clothing once we're done with it, you can move to the next slide. We have a year ago done an on-the-ground investigation in Kenya to see what happens with used clothing exported to the global south. And we chose Kenya because it receives a significant amount of clothing from the EU and the UK. It receives around 900 million items of clothing every year. Because also the customs and trade data allowed us to get a better picture of it. By the way, we have like a short documentary available on YouTube. It's only 12 minutes where you can really see the impact. But what we wanted to see is really what happens with the export of used clothing. How much of that gets reused or recycled as opposed to being landfilled or burned in the country of destination. And you can go to the next slide. And what it looks like in practice is that this, you know, truck full of bales arrives to Kenya, and the traders pay for a bale up front, not knowing what's in it. So it's sort of like playing a lottery. And they report that 20 to 50% of that bale is waste, immediately waste, because it's not suitable for reuse. And that is because these clothes were found to be damaged, not fit for the climate. Sometimes you find vomit on it, they are ripped and so forth. So immediately after being opened, they are being, landfilled or burned. What is more is that although, you know, the export of plastic waste is somehow restricted by the Basel Convention, and it's also to be banned in the EU, the textile sector or clothing is not accounted in these discussions. And we found that 1/3 of all that waste is actually plastic waste. Next slide. So this is what then the end life of this clothing looks like. These, for example, are pictures from Dandora dump site in Kenya, which is the biggest dump site that was already proclaimed full in 2001, but still they receive thousands and thousands of tons of clothing every day. So you have this dump site where like the smoke is coming out all the time because of the burning clothes, and the dump site is surrounded by housing, schools, and so forth. Some of it is also sold to, for example, peanut roasters on the picture on the left. So what you see there is basically peanuts being roasted on a pile of burning synthetic clothing. So the locals are inhaling this smoke on a daily basis. And it really just shows basically, you know, that we have huge drawbacks in the waste management system today, and the global south is left to deal with the problem that basically us people in the global north have created and offloaded on them. Next slide, please. So when we approached fashion brands, and every year, as I mentioned, we assess more than 50 of the biggest fashion brands on where they stand in terms of moving away from fast fashion model and their waste management systems. Many of them came back to us saying, well, we have a take-back scheme in place, so we have this issue sorted. And for this reason, we have decided to do another investigation that lasted for almost a year. We have basically concealed air tags into 21 clothing items, and we submitted them to these take-back schemes, meaning the boxes you find today in many of the stores that promise to, you know, give your clothes a second life, close the loop. But in general, they promise that your clothing will be reused or recycled. So we have for 11 months basically tracked these items for every day to see what happened to them. And the discrepancy between the claims made by fashion brands and what was actually the destiny of these items is huge. You can go to the next slide. We basically found that, sorry, it's really small, so you won't see, but that 76% of these clothes were discarded. They were either stuck in warehouses, they were destroyed, or they were sent halfway across the world to be dumped there. For example, we had an H&M skirt that was deposited at the London store, and it literally traveled halfway across the world, 24,000 kilometers from London to United Emirates to Mali, where it was discarded. We had another item of trousers that was basically sent to be used as fuel for a cement kiln. And just to say, all the items that we used and put trackers on were of good quality because we basically bought them in a secondhand store, so they were fit to be reused. Meaning, you know, that there is a huge disrespect for the waste hierarchy that should go, you know, repair, reuse, recycle, and only when that is not possible, the clothes should be, you know, discarded in some way. So we also found that, of course, the sorting is not fit for purpose if clothing in good quality is being discarded. So sorry, I'm a bit rushing through because we have so many investigations done, but you can move on to the next slide. All of the things that we have done are captured also through videos. You can go on our website or on YouTube on Changing Markets in order to get a better understanding of the waste issue and any other issue in terms of linked to fossil fashion that you're interested in. So back to you, Kim.
Ursak, thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear about all the projects that you've worked on at the Changing Markets Foundation. And I think it really illustrates how clothing is a really good example of the way that we use all our materials and how sustainable all our systems are, because so many of the things you talked about are relevant to the other materials we use, how we're exporting them to other countries and exporting the waste to other countries, and the greenwashing, the putting pressure on people as well, rather than corporations taking responsibility for the waste that they make. We're going to move on to the next presentation. So I think we probably are going to run over as well at this point. Please, if you had the time to stay on, that would be it's great, so that you can hear our final two speakers. And without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Izzie Eriksen, the CEO of ApparelXChange. Izzie, I've got some slides to share for you as well, so I'll just set those up for you now.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks. So I'm going to try and pick up a wee bit of the time that we've lost, because I know that's kind of a wee bit of a challenge for Kim to chair. So yeah, I'm actually the managing director, founder rather than CEO, but thanks for my promotion there, Kim. That was great. So yeah, ApparelXChange, we're kids reuse. When my kids went to school, I just felt kind of overwhelmed by the amount of school uniform and clothing that they needed. So that really instigated me about 5 or 6 years ago to set ApparelXChange up. We describe ourselves as a social circular enterprise. So we set out very much to stop this distinction between circularity and social justice. So it was really great to have Kate kind of bring that to the fore. And obviously that's at the heart of Friends of the Earth Scotland too as well. By doing that, we very much kind of are a reuse fashion model. So we take in donations of clothing for school-aged children, so that's about 4 to 18. We have a big warehouse in the city centre of Glasgow where we process everything, and we retail it online or in our Southside shop. And we combine that with education and awareness raising, because part of what we recognise is if we want people to change behaviours, they need to have the knowledge to do so. And also we need to kind of get over some of the barriers that I think a lot of people have around, you know, feeling quite insignificant and very overwhelmed by the challenges that we have around the climate emergency that we're in, and particularly in a city like Glasgow where we've got such a diverse population. How does everyone from a very young age go, I can make a difference? You know, I might be a drop in the ocean, but many drops make a big difference. So we're all about ensuring that, you know, as soon as kids go to school, they understand what they can do to make a contribution to slowing climate change down. And finally, part of what we do as well is we provide clothing packages. So we sell, because we are a circular social enterprise, so we're a kick as an organization, we're not a charity. We sell stuff, we sell the clothing at low cost, but we also provide it for free as well to families who need some extra support. So that kind of gives you all the parts to what we do. So next slide, please. Here's just some images, because I know when you're on calls, it's nice to just have a little bit of visual. This is our shop on the south side. We actually had to shut the original shop because of COVID, and it really has taken us a couple of years to kind of find somewhere new and kind of re-establish ourselves. And I put this background into my shot just to see what our windows are decorated like at the moment. So, you know, we try and have a lot of fun, and essentially we're trying to encourage people to come in and understand that, you know, by buying secondhand, it's a very typical kind of retail experience. So this isn't about being in a really jam-packed, very uncurated shop. This is about being able to go in and find clothing and having a really kind of pleasant experience when you go in. So on to the next slide. One of the things we've been doing more and more is whenever we have conversations with stakeholders, whether that's Scottish MSPs or UK ministers or local authorities or colleagues, is to really try and not quite talk the language that they're expecting, but to really emphasize all of the impacts we have when it comes to kind of policy outcomes. And so we created this slide really just to communicate that very clearly. So you know, the environmental one in terms of the carbon savings from reuse versus recycling or disposal. You know, we're very much all about reuse. We're all about reuse here in Scotland. We're trying to get in between those clothing banks and those return systems, which cause some of the problems that Ursak was talking about there. So I'll talk a bit more about our clothing system in a minute. In terms of the economic, we've grown. We now employ 7 people, which is a massive achievement for us. So we're creating jobs here in Scotland, but we're also tackling some of those challenges with the cost of living crisis and limited household budgets. And we have an awful lot of people here in Glasgow living within poverty, and also a lot of people who are working but still experiencing poverty and clothing poverty. I've obviously spoken about the educational side, as well as kind of health and well-being is an area I haven't touched on yet, but we work with another charity in Scotland, in Glasgow, rather, called Scottish Sports Futures. And that's very much about providing active wear branded tracksuits and joggers and sportswear, because actually one of the massive problems from COVID was public health and ensuring that young people actually have the clothing and the footwear to get themselves back into active lives. So that's a big part. That's been kind of a bit of a spin-off for us, because it makes a lot of sense, and it's a very real issue for Glasgow. So next slide. So onto kind of our clothing system. So, you know, when I set ApparelXChange up, it was very much, wanted to do something about clothing. I've always worked within the social circular economy. I've worked within environmental policy, and I found myself, really wanting to make a difference and do something very active. But when we set up, it was all about kind of a membership model around school uniform, and that wasn't sort of economically viable, nor was Scotland really ready for models like that. And we still have challenges with rental models being viable. Particularly with low price goods like children's wear. So we had to really sort of test lots of different ideas, and we came up with kind of our vision, which is a clothing system for a city. So we said, actually, if we're really going to make a difference and look at the scope of influence that we have here in Scotland, because we won't be able to change everything within the supply chain and workers' rights, what difference can we make here? How do we affect change? How do we take this valuable resource, use this clothing commodity, and tackle some of those big social problems we have here in the UK and in Glasgow? And that's where we came up with our clothing systems vision. And this slide goes some way to kind of describe that. And of course, we always are going to have that flow of new product from brands and retailers coming into our system. But what we're trying to do is really slow that demand down and really slow that throughput down, and really use all of that legacy product, which is currently going around people's homes and making sure it doesn't really end up as black bag waste. And some of the statistics we have in here in Scotland about the volume of waste is, that something like 60,000 tonnes per year is still going into landfill for clothing. So someone might correct me with some more up-to-date figures, and I'd love to hear them if you've got something more recent than that. We have this warehouse in the city centre. It's 5,000 square foot, and that's where we basically do all of our processing, and we do a lot of data capture. And we're actually expanding the data capture piece, because what we're trying to do is create an evidence base which we can use to influence brands to do something about their products and actually work with us for the social impact of reuse. So they might not be motivated or find it as easy to kind of get themselves into their own sort of circular models around materials, but actually if they're interested in the social impact of what we do, then we're keen to work with them. The top right of this is something that we set out really to establish here in Glasgow as well, which was a sustainable fashion quarter, and we actually co-locate with 7 other micro businesses all within the sustainable fashion. We've actually branded ourselves early this year as the Fair Fashion Collective, so that feels like a real step forwards. So next slide, please. I'm going to skip this one if that's all right, Kim. I'm just thinking a wee bit about time and messaging. And I'm going to skip this one too, guys. Sorry. Social impact. So this is actually out of date already, because we do a clothing bank every summer. So actually we've provided 2,174 clothing packages for families and young people across Glasgow, and that's involved over 17,000 garments, and to the value of about £53,000. So what I'm trying to illustrate with this is actually there's an awful lot that can be done with this clothing, and it doesn't need to be exported. And with the right systems in place, we can make that happen. And part of the clothing system that we've designed, and that we actually won the Social Innovation Challenge Award through First Port earlier this year for, was to create a kind of a clothing collection infrastructure, which allows the householder to donate to us and for the clothing to come to us before it goes in those clothing banks for export. So we're very much about trying to get in there before it gets exported. So if you want to page on. Thanks. I've put this slide in here because often what you have to remind local authorities, government ministers, other social organisations, private organisations, big corporate banks who operate in Glasgow is there's lots of benefits to working with organisations like ours, and particularly when you're trying to provide services across the city. So, let's take us back to that policy outcome slide. We are now seeing far more kind of uptake and understanding of what we do, providing the benefit, providing and meeting all of those kind of policy outcomes that local authorities are desiring. So it's been really refreshing, and we're starting to see some of that harder work pay off. If you want to go on to the next slide. And this is a wee bit about the Fair Fashion Collective, and this is the branding we came up with earlier, and these are the organisations that we co-locate with on the south side of Glasgow. And it's probably worth saying that, you know, whether it's the clothing system or the Fair Fashion Collective, it's something that we're looking to replicate across other cities in Scotland and across the UK. And then the next slide, and that might be, oh yes, so this is the last one, and hopefully a good segue into the conversation around the circular economy bill. So I alluded to having worked in policy before, and what's always been quite interesting as an organisation, and a small organisation like ours, and we're kind of constantly engaging with different layers of stakeholders, is actually really understanding what we need to survive. So, you know, what the biggest challenge we've got is, you know, if you want the circular economy to happen, you really have to stop the flow of cheap, underpriced clothing entering the market, because we cannot compete with £2.50 t-shirts that can be bought on the high street, not when it costs to reuse, recycle, and refurbish and resell. And there's a real reality check. So we have very much pushed for this, creating an equitable marketplace. Now, if there isn't any desire for that at a UK Gov level, well, we're never going to see a circular economy, and that there's a real reality check around that. And some of the things that we need to see is we need to see changes to corporate law, that's companies law, which is about don't just report on your financial position, you need to report on your environmental and social supply chain and your value chain as well. So all of this needs to be annually reported, and that should be mandated and a legal requirement for running any organisation in Scotland. I've got a bit of a history in EPR, so constantly pushing on textiles EPR, but the way textiles EPR could be designed is very much about making sure that those reuse loops sustain themselves, and that actually start seeing the environmental the social impact of those gathered too, so that we don't see some really high throughputs only of large tonnages of recyclate, because we will lose the value from reuse. That on refurbished or rental, that's an important area, which is something that sits with the Treasury down at a UK level, and of course carbon taxation as well. But one of the things that we can influence is local service delivery and empowering consumers as well. So, you know, we're very much about ensuring that procurement is undertaken in such a way that organisations like ours can actually tender for service contracts around clothing packages, and collaborating as well with local authorities to provide those. So so we've got a fair few ideas about how we would like things to change locally here in Scotland. So if you just want to page onto the last one, I think that's in it. I think that's in it a nutshell, and I think it's over to Ruth now as well. So thank you so much for listening.
Izzie, thank you so much. That was brilliant. There were a couple of questions in the chat. I'll let you have a look at those. There were a couple of people as well saying this should be nationwide. So just to say that there is a website, you can go and buy clothing from ApparelXChange online. I think also it's really worth kind of emphasizing the fact that the scale of the operation of what Izzie has done with ApparelXChange is amazing. A citywide reuse scheme, and this is the level of ambition that we really need for the circular economy in the future. So yeah, thank you so much for coming to talk to us tonight, Izzie. We are going to move on very swiftly to our last talk, which is from Ruth from War and Want. Ruth, I've got your slides here as well.
Thank you. Yes, thanks, Kim. Sorry, you've got a job of dealing with all of our presentations. I just want to say that everything that sort of Jemima said, and Ursak, and then Izzie, that really inspiring presentation there. I think what I'm going to speak to sort of sits a little bit in the middle of that. So we've heard a lot around the harms that fashion has done. And Ursak, also in our report that I'll be talking about, we draw a lot on that amazing research work that you do. And then Izzie, you looking at, well, actually practically doing some of these alternatives. So I feel like I've maybe come in and at the benefit of all the other expertise that's been shown. So yes, I was sort of asked to have a look at the focus around. We've looked at the fashion as a big problem, and maybe to focus a little bit more about really big thinking around what the future of fashion could look like. So our report came out this year called Fashioning the Future, with the ambitious subtitle of Fixing the Fashion Industry for Workers and Climate. I should say, despite that ambitious title, we're not trying to put a blueprint in this report about, exactly how this industry should be transformed. We are seeking to sort of show, we want to show why is big fashion. We sort of use the term big fashion the way it is. So locating it in that business model and the economic system that we're in now. And that is inherently damaging for people and for planet. And in this report, we then started to explore ideas that have been coming together through sort of being known as sort of degrowth economics, how those really offer up alternatives, radical ways of rethinking our economies and the principles at the heart of them, and how that would then transform fashion. So maybe next slide, please. You will be glad to know I am not going to go through all of this, but I did want to just sort of say that, I'm only really focusing in this presentation on a small part, which is really sort of looking about what we discuss a lot in chapter 1 and chapter 2 in this report. So trying to look at how wealth is extracted from the global south and what degrowth approach is and isn't, and that offers a very different way about thinking about fashion. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but I will perhaps put in the chat a link to our report so that you can see it there, and it is interactive, so you can go through the different chapters, click on all the references and footnotes, which is very helpful for people doing research, I think, to see where information is coming from. So I'll just move on to the next slide, please. This covers a little bit of information that's been covered before, but I wanted to just look at, we've heard basically fashion is hugely profitable. Levels of production and consumption and profit are all just exponentially increasing. The reasons for that are a lot around how our global economy has changed and how that changes what fashion and fashion companies can really achieve. So, when we heard around, this picture sort of shows on one level, where is our clothing made? How has that shifted? So you can see that between sort of the 70s and the 90s, that production shifts away from the countries where we're from the UK and America, and it's being moved predominantly into sort of South Asia and beyond. Why? Well, there were changes in our global economy and politics. So there was a growing dominance of sort of more neoliberal economic ideologies and ideas, sort of increased privatization, very much liberalizing trade, encouraging that foreign investment, and the idea that you want to, not having restrictions on where capital can move around, and that goods are a really key part of growth, and that countries take a place in the global economy. So they serve a purpose in a global sense, not just within national boundaries. One thing I want to sort of say here is that obviously this shows how production has shifted, but bear in mind that the consumption is all heavily in the global north, the UK, and Europe and the Americas. But you can see here, where are all the significant number of the jobs and the livelihoods with that production, and where are all the materials and the land and resources coming from, are from the global south. The profits are also accumulating, obviously, in UK, Europe, and America. So when we talk about fashioning the future, I think we should think about it's about people, and it's not just how our clothes get made, but where are people and where is land and our planet in that process. I think we'll move forward to the next slide. I put this here, workers or planet, because when I've approached this and looking at fashioning in the future, I think one thing is that fashion, social and environmental crimes, as we put them, they have the same systemic causes. So what I was saying there about how our global economy now operates. And yet sometimes the debate has been sort of polarized, or sense that you have to make a choice. But neither environmental or workers' rights campaigners, you can risk, this being sort of co-opted and being divided. One, because it's not a real divide. The reasons why wages can stay low, why companies can produce so much and dump so much, it comes this a similar cause. Also, I think in terms of looking for change, it's very important that we hold these together. In our report, we focus around, there was in 2019, H&M's CEO sort of made an interview, and he was sort of talking about, if you're shaming fashion consumers, that might lead to a small environmental impact, but it'll have really damaging social consequences. Now, arguably, I would say that probably H&M isn't that concerned about the social consequences, because we know that in terms of living wages and of all the impacts of their production, it's there. But of course, it's a very it's a statement around, oh, well, if you do this, then there's this damage here. And of course, that is very concerning for justice-based organizations and campaigners and any individuals, because it sets up this idea that you can't have, you have to make a choice. And it also feeds into, when we're trying to have progressive change, that people will feel, oh, well, we can't do it. It reduces license. It makes people scared about change. And so here at the bottom, I've put, the real culprit is, what we'll go on to the next slide, is growthism. If we could move on to that next slide. Right, so this is where our report gets into the economic sort of theory. So I'm pleased to only sort of probably summarize that, and I won't be doing it full justice, but at the end there are some links so that there's a website and to some of the economists that are quoted here, so you'll be able to follow those up. But essentially, degrowth questions that relentless extraction of both natural resources, the planet's resources, and people in the pursuit of corporate profit. And it's proposing that those who are most responsible for that climate damage must, obviously reduce that production and consume less. And the idea is to prioritize moving into a society and economies that center different values. So it's about social and environmental well-being, replacing the gross domestic product or those profit margins as what is really important. So here I put on the quote that's in our report, that growthism is this idea that the economy must just go on growing and growing all the time, regardless of whether society actually needs it to, and no matter the consequences. And I think it's really exemplified incredibly well in fashion. We've heard about, just the scale of production and the scale of waste is incredible. And is driving us to this ecological breakdown. So an alternative that has been coming through from the challenge of this is that we decide what sectors actually do need to grow, and those which are destructive or less sort of necessary. And so we should be looking at how those are scaled down or even ended entirely. So this sort of is become known around a whole set of theories and approaches and understandings called degrowth. If you could move to the next slide, because it just continues on a bit. I should say that here, it's calling about societies, local and global, to prioritize instead of corporate profit. And rather than aiming to reduce all forms of production, degrowth is specifically about how you reduce those less necessary forms of production. And it is targeted at rich global north countries, because we are the ones most responsible for driving that damage. And it is not, therefore, a recession or a plan to make workers jobless or impoverished and to pay the price of change. I think it's really important to say that, because I think degrowth can get somewhat, well, that's just about stopping production. And then, obviously, inevitably, the question is, well, what about all of the peoples whose livelihoods now is dependent on it? We saw with COVID and subsequent economic sort of shocks, cost of living, what happens to workers throughout, the supply chain, from the production of materials through to factories, through to retail and warehousing. What happens then is that there's no protection. And actually what fashion companies did was they act in a very logical way to preserve profits. But that's an example of an unplanned and definitely not degrowth. But I'd wanted to flash that up in terms of an understanding of what degrowth is and isn't. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So I think this sort of says it all. I was waiting for somebody else to contradict me on the statistics. It is also very hard to find precise figures around the industry, but 100 billion pieces of clothing, 24.4 billion shoes. I mean, as that quote says, by the loosest definition of what constitutes human need, fashion is really an extreme example of a sector that's organized around socially unnecessary production. However, absolutely vital if you want to keep increasing your profits. So this is the challenge. If we could move to the next slide, please. I included this quote, it's in our report, and we have a few quite provoking comments from Kalpana, who's from the Bangladesh Centre for Worker Solidarity, which I think go back to us recognising the need to approach this in a really intersectional and justice way, which other speakers have spoken about. So here her quote's obviously, you know, what happens if this industry shrinks dramatically in our current economic order is that essentially tens of millions of people's kind of lose their livelihoods. From farmers to factory workers, freight drivers, warehouse workers, etc. So we know how do you do that, degrow and actually get sort of more in this fashion industry. If you could move on to the next slide, please. Sorry if I'm going a bit fast on 3. So in the report, this is really very summarized. I would say that if you want to look at this a bit more, please sort of have a look at the chapter 2 in particular in our report. What about the jobs is that question that comes up, like, well, it needs to produce less, consume less, but then what will happen? You know, the quote here around, you know, workers being in the global, being in fashion, but can't afford to build toilet in the house. So this gives an example of how what a job is about is to sort of secure your basic needs for food, shelter, etc. But this is not being met by the fashion industry as it's currently constructed. What is it doing? It's accumulating capital for profit. So the quote below that you see there from Jason Hickel is really drawing attention to that. So when we think about jobs, we have to really think about, well, why are people working? And what is it that they need to secure for a decent, dignified life? As opposed to, we have to work to accumulate profit for corporate profit. And then I think degrowth then really does start to help us really think differently about our economies and the future of fashion. Fashion has notoriously low-waged jobs, but their people are in them and they are dependent, and countries have been locked into them, the economic model. But then if you start scaling back the industry, you have to start thinking about what would that look like in 2 regions, richer nations in the global north and also poorer in the global south. So, for example, if you scale back unnecessary forms of production, actually, you know, shorter working weeks, that frees up more time for millions of hours in terms of maybe care and other socially useful and restorative activities. There is the concept about becoming a society of prosumers. So we're also engaged a little bit like we've heard in the repair, the production, the sharing of goods that we already have, and those being independent of those very industrialized and profit orientated systems. Also things around job guarantees, particularly for socially vital products and services. And a really important thing to sort of say in this is that essential services should be for public good rather than as a commodity for profit. So, you know, if the point of transport is transport or communication, the things that we need, energy, education, healthcare, you take the profit out of that, you don't make them a commodity, then people have access to those resources that underpin what you need for a dignified life. It's not all on about a wage packet. So as much as it is absolutely vital that we achieve living wages, it is also really important that we make sure that we are pushing for really universal public services and really strong mechanisms of social protection. If we can move to the next slide, please. So here, this is again sort of how it's been quoted in our report, that amid this injustice is a place of great possibility. So if we start thinking about our economy as not centering profit, but centering other things and running along different imperatives of values, we see countries in the global south are not poor because they lack people to work or land or natural resources, the absolute opposite. But at the moment, they're all organized around economic interests of the global north and corporate profit. And our political and economic systems make sure that that stays hardwired in at the moment. So trade, tax, debt, the political power that rich nations have over the rules that keeps this system in place. We have to then start imagining, well, how could this be different if it wasn't like that? You know, as Jemima was saying, how might Bangladesh look different if all of its productive capacity was not organized around fashion or those other industries, but was in other areas? So I think in the report, what we're trying to sort of say here is think about all of that time and resources going into things of much different value, not for profit. And of course, at the moment, our global economy is structured in such a way is to stop global south countries from deciding how to use that productive capacity in these ways. And it is around gaining the income, the foreign exchange to purchase, to buy, to service debt, etc. If we want to move on to the next slide. So in fashioning the future, we strongly say that we have to think about all of our economies within which fashion sits. So fashion reflects it and fashion must change. And that really we have to sort of look at ways that we can, the degrowth means removing those barriers from countries currently locked in to fashion export as their main economic lifeline, and being able to make genuinely sovereign decisions, democratic decisions within their populations around economic development and priorities. And it means that people who are dependent on fashion should be the ones who are really at the heart of that transition, and ensuring that those other conditions allowing for dignified life once big fashion is leaving the stage are in place. So that is around trade, as I was saying, around tax, corporate accountability. It's about investing in the public services and I hope then, yeah, I might just, if you move on to the next slide, I won't spend too long on this, but in our report, Tansy Hoskins, who wrote the Stitched Up and then the Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion, she was one of the main writer for our report. And drawing on her book, she does chapter 6, I think it is, and it's kind of like a thought exercise. It's really interesting. I would encourage you to read it, where there's 2 questions that are posed. You know, what kind of society do you want to live in? And in that society, what is fashion for? And that throws up a lot of different ideas. So if you don't have the lens of, well, it's about creating billionaires and endless amounts of profit, but I want to live in a society where everyone has what they need, or those things, fashion then, and how the clothes that we wear are made and produced and how we use them and share them is all very different. And there's a whole chapter with lots of really different, interesting ideas. And I think that's important for giving us a picture. It's very difficult to imagine a different economy running along very different lines. So sometimes things like that really help. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that. And then I think the final slide, if that's okay. Just ending on a quote really that comes from sort of at the end of our report, and really is holding together that, you know, everything we wear, we've been hearing from Jemima to Ursak, and also Izzie, it's the product of our land, natural resources, and people's labour. So we have to hold both together in fashioning a better future, and that our economy is run along lines that that centre different principles. In the report at the end, we go through a number of areas that we discuss need repair. So, you know, more than the physicality of our clothes being repaired and cared for, our whole economies should be about care and repair. And I think I'll leave it there because I know we have run on a bit long. So thank you. There are some links at the end as well if people would like.
Thank you so much, Ruth. It is really good to hear you advocating for a really clear solution that goes to the root of the problem, not just with clothing, but with all our material consumption. We have run over, so we are definitely going to stop in a few minutes' time, which means that we won't have time for questions, I'm afraid. I'm really sorry for the technical difficulties that we've had tonight. That has meant that we've had to change our plans a bit. I hope you will agree with me that our speakers have done a fantastic job in explaining all the issues and solutions that we need to see around the clothing sector. So thank you very much to all four of our speakers for coming tonight and for sharing your knowledge with us. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Ailey and Kate, for helping set up tonight and keeping it running. And thank you very much to everybody who's given their time tonight as well. Instead of questions, I'm just going to hand over to Kate very quickly for some final words on highlighting what's coming up with the circular economy bill, and then we will let you go.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, a couple of things. If you are not already, make sure that you have signed the pledge for the circular economy campaign, and that means that you'll get regular emails from us with things that are coming up and actions and ways that you can do things to support the circular economy campaign throughout the course of this bill. One of the things that we've been doing is these webinars, which are aiming to expose the kind of invisibility of the supply chain. So we've done one on mining and rare metals, and that's available on YouTube. We can send that out. This has obviously looked at the process of like the fashion and clothing industry, and we're also planning more in the new year, probably around plastic and how we've touched upon that tonight, but you know, the supply chain of that and how all of the like plastic products that we have are created and disposed of. We've got a really exciting event coming up to coincide with when this bill is first debated in the Scottish Parliament, and that's going to be a circular economy showcase outside the Parliament on the 18th of January from 1 till 2. So if you're in Edinburgh and you can come down at lunchtime, please do. We've got lots of reuse organisations from across Scotland who are going to be showcasing their work, and we're going to be kind of doing that in a bit of a like fashion show showcase, really fun event, and inviting MSPs to come out and see the work that's already being done around reuse and repair in Scotland, but also we'll be making the point of how the products that have been reused and repaired, you know, how they're manufactured and disposed of, the kind of things that we've been talking about tonight. So we're making that point and calling for a stronger bill. And yeah, stay in touch through the pledge throughout the process of this bill, and there'll be many more things coming up. And I think on that we will close, but it's been great to see you all. Thanks to all the speakers, and have a good evening.